In the 1930s, the German Luftwaffe started expanding at a breakneck pace. After years of strict limitations from the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, Germany, under Nazi leadership, kicked off a massive rearmament effort. This explosive growth in military aviation meant they desperately needed a new generation of modern trainer aircraft. Young pilots had to be prepared quickly and thoroughly. They needed to make the demanding transition to high-performance fighters and bombers. Officially established in 1935 under the command of Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe made mass pilot training its top priority. To crew their rapidly expanding fleet, High Command shifted its approach. They focused heavily on advanced flight training. Pilots started getting hands-on instruction in aerobatics and complex navigation. They also learned to execute a wide variety of combat missions. To meet these ambitious goals, the Reich Air Ministry Technical Department issued an official requirement in 1936. They were looking for a modern, two-seat, single-engine trainer aircraft. The specs were clear. It absolutely needed retractable landing gear for better aerodynamics. It also needed a fully enclosed cockpit to protect the crew while still offering excellent visibility. On top of that, the aircraft had to be fully equipped for both instrument and night flying. This would allow it to simulate actual combat conditions as accurately as possible. The primary goal of this competition was to finally replace their aging training biplanes. The new aircraft had to be easy to maintain and repair. It also had to be reliable to fly. Above all, it had to be designed for mass production, since the Luftwaffe's demand kept growing by the day. Stepping up to the challenge was Arado, one of Germany's leading aircraft manufacturers since the early 1930s. Development was led by chief designer Walter Blum. He had joined the company in 1933. He brought extensive experience in designing both trainer aircraft and fighters. His proposed design was an all-metal, low-wing monoplane. Its fuselage and wings featured a stressed skin construction that carried the structural loads during flight. This advanced engineering approach struck the perfect balance between structural integrity and ease of mass production. This was crucial when resources had to be strictly managed. This approach was a major leap forward compared to the company's older trainer models. For example, the AR-68 biplane rolled out in 1935 as a stopgap fighter trainer. It still featured open cockpits and fabric-covered wings. But the new model, the AR-96, gave instructors excellent visibility thanks to its modern layout. The aircraft handled much more predictably at high speeds. It also delivered vastly improved all-around performance when executing complex aerobatic maneuvers. The story of the AR-96 trainer aircraft officially began in 1937. That was when the first prototype was built at the Arado factory in Warnemünde, Germany. It was an all-metal, low-wing monoplane specifically designed for advanced pilot training. It featured a fully enclosed tandem cockpit, seating the instructor and student one behind the other. The aircraft was powered by a 240-horsepower Argus AS-10C engine. Interestingly enough, on that first prototype, the main landing gear retracted outward. However, on later production models, they abandoned this unusual setup. This change gave the aircraft a wider, more stable track while taxiing on the ground. This aircraft made its first flight in 1938 from the airfield in Warnemünde. It kicked off an extensive flight test program. During these early flights, engineers focused on evaluating its basic flight characteristics. The prototype demonstrated remarkably docile handling at low speeds. This was exactly what was needed for training student pilots. To refine the design, several more prototypes were built. In late 1938, they were sent for rigorous evaluation at the primary Luftwaffe test center in Rechlin. There, the airframes were thoroughly tested for stability and control. They were also checked for overall structural integrity across a wide flight envelope. Test pilots evaluated the stall characteristics and spin recovery of the aircraft. The results were highly promising for the new trainer. Throughout 1938 and 1939, the flight test program was significantly expanded. It now included weapons trials. The AR-96 was intended not just for basic flight training, but also for tactical and gunnery instruction. Because of this, it was fitted with 2 machine guns. One was a fixed forward-firing gun. The other was a flexible rear-facing gun for defensive training. However, during these trials, it became apparent that the original engine was severely underpowered. This drastically limited the top speed and rate of climb of the aircraft. engineers decided to rework the design. By early 1939, the aircraft was fitted with a much more powerful engine. It was the 465 horsepower Argus AS-410A. This vastly improved its flight performance. At the same time, the aircraft remained just as light and pleasant to fly. To accommodate the larger engine, designers only had to make minor aerodynamic tweaks to the cowling. Throughout 1939, Luftwaffe experts at Rechlin continued their exhaustive evaluations. They confirmed that the AR-96 was a highly versatile advanced trainer. It was perfectly suited even for complex instrument flying and night operations. Despite the early lack of power, the overall reliability and ease of maintenance of the design were the deciding factors. In late 1939, the military officially ordered the first pre-production batch of aircraft. The AR-96 easily outperformed its competitors. It became the standard advanced trainer for German pilots. A few early prototypes were retained for testing well into 1940. This was to finalize minor modifications before kicking off full-scale mass production. From there, the aircraft moved into the tooling and full-scale production phase. The production history of this aircraft actually begins in 1939. That is when manufacturing of the initial AR-96A variant began at the Arado factory. However, the production capacity of the plant was fairly limited. The company was tied up with other higher priority military contracts. Because of this, by early 1940, production was quickly shifted to Oschersleben. Specifically, it moved to the AGO plant, which was a subsidiary of Junkers. The move proved to be a massive success. Transferring the contract allowed them to significantly ramp up production numbers. By April 1941, over 200 units of the primary production variant had rolled off the assembly line. This was the AR-96B model. In 1940, engineers slightly updated the design of the AR-96B. This helped to streamline mass production and integrate the more powerful Argus AS-410A1 engine. They lengthened the fuselage. This not only increased fuel capacity, but also improved longitudinal stability. Additionally, the main landing gear was redesigned to retract flush into the wings. This widened the gear track. It significantly improved ground handling for student pilots. These engineering choices leaned heavily on standardized metal components. This allowed assembly lines to churn out airframes much faster. At the same time, it retained that rugged all-metal monoplane design. It was perfectly suited for the early war years. The military needed aircraft as fast as possible and in massive numbers. They needed this without having to completely switch over to alternative construction materials. Starting in mid-1941, main production was shifted to occupied Czechoslovakia. This was a strategic move to hide factories from increasingly heavy Allied bombing raids. It also allowed them to tap into a massive pool of forced labor. The Avia plant in Prague took the lead. Later on, in 1944, the Letov factory joined in to set up what they called dispersed production. Decentralizing the factories like this kept aircraft rolling off the assembly line. This continued even as plants back in Germany were taking a relentless pounding. Though, as you would expect, it created a logistical nightmare when it came to supplying spare parts to the assembly lines. By the final years of the war, the situation had become critical. Due to a constant shortage of the original Argus engines, ground crews had to fit temporary, improvised engines onto some of the airframes. On top of that, with the constant threat of air raids overhead, factories had to let quality control slip just to speed up assembly. As a result, the reliability of these late production airplanes was incredibly inconsistent. They ranged from perfectly fine to barely airworthy. Desperate attempts to save even more on strategic materials eventually led to the development of a new model, the AR-396. This trainer was built with a single goal in mind: to cut down the use of scarce strategic metals as much as possible. But time ran out. They never managed to get the aircraft into full production before the fall of Germany. The AR-96 officially entered Luftwaffe service in 1939, becoming its standard advanced trainer. This was the aircraft on which future fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance pilots truly honed their skills. With its all-metal monoplane design and retractable landing gear, it completely replaced the older training biplanes. It served as the perfect stepping stone, transitioning cadets to high-performance combat aircraft. By late 1939, training units began receiving their first batches of the AR-96A series. and by 1940, the more powerful AR-96B had become the backbone of the training fleet. The Luftwaffe put this aircraft to heavy use in their flight schools, known as Flugzeugführerschulen. This is where young pilots learned the ropes of instrument, formation, and night flying. It was the crucial next step after basic training. It prepared cadets for the harsh realities of frontline combat. The training syllabus placed a heavy emphasis on complex maneuvers. Cadets would practice aerobatics and fly simulated reconnaissance missions. This ensured they could confidently handle the aircraft in the toughest conditions. The cockpit featured a standard tandem layout. The instructor was seated right behind the student. Thanks to a dual control setup, the instructor could take full command of the aircraft at any time. Even with constant wartime part shortages, this trainer earned a stellar reputation. It became an incredibly tough and reliable workhorse for the daily grind of flight instruction. But the AR-96 was not confined strictly to rear echelon flight schools. It also saw heavy use with frontline replacement squadrons, known in German as Ergänzungsstaffeln. These units gave veteran pilots a chance to brush up on their skills after a break. Meanwhile, rookies could get a feel for their unit's specific tactics before ever seeing actual combat. These replacement squadrons were often attached directly to the active fighter wings. Flying these trainers so close to the front lines helped pilots acclimate to a combat environment much faster. This played a major role in the rapid expansion of the Luftwaffe. Even though the Arado Ar-96 was designed primarily as an advanced trainer to transition pilots to frontline fighters, it actually wound up flying several different roles during World War II. As the German High Command started facing a severe shortage of purpose-built combat aircraft, the Luftwaffe had to improvise. They pressed whatever they had on hand into frontline service. Take the AR-96B2 variant, for example. It was fitted with a single 7.92mm MG-17 machine gun. This was mounted on the right side of the engine cowling. Initially, this was strictly for gunnery training, but eventually some of these aircraft were sent out on light combat sorties. Another version, the AR-96B6, featured underwing bomb racks. It could carry up to 220 pounds of ordnance. This allowed pilots to fly improvised close air support missions. During the desperate defensive battles in the final stages of the war, the AR-96 was forced into reconnaissance and transport roles as well. One of its most famous episodes happened during the Battle of Berlin in April 1945. That is when the renowned test pilot Hanna Reitsch took off in an AR-96. She flew from an improvised airstrip near the Tiergarten. Her main objective was to evacuate the newly appointed Luftwaffe commander, Robert Ritter von Greim. To pull this off, she had to fly low through heavy fire from Soviet infantry and anti-aircraft batteries. Sorties like this proved just how capable the aircraft could be in a liaison role. This was true even under the most extreme conditions. But the aircraft's use was not limited to Germany. It was exported as well. Back in 1940, 24 of the AR-96B2 variants were delivered to the Royal Bulgarian Air Force. There, they successfully served in both pilot training and courier roles. The aircraft's story did not end with World War II, though. After the war, production of the Arado Ar-96 continued in Czechoslovakia. Local factories rolled out the C-2B variant. This was based entirely on the original German design. Between 1945 and 1950, they manufactured around 410 of these trainers. Most of them went straight to the Czechoslovak Air Force for advanced flight training. They served faithfully in their flight academies right up until the end of 1955. At that point, they were finally replaced by more modern aircraft. Meanwhile, the French developed their own wooden version of the aircraft. This was designated as the AR-396. Starting in 1947, the SIPA company took over its production. They started off by building 28 of the baseline S-10 version. This saw use in both military and civil aviation. Engineers eventually took things a step further and rolled out the armed S-11 variant. Some of these were even sent to serve in the Algerian War. They were equipped with machine guns, rockets, and bombs. Later on, they followed that up with an all-metal variant called the S-12. Thanks to these post-war developments, the French Air Force kept the Arado legacy flying right up until the end of the 1950s. Right after the fighting in Europe ended, Allied forces took full advantage of captured stockpiles of German AR-96s. They used them for flight testing and to help their pilots evaluate former enemy aircraft. They simply repainted these airframes and applied their own national roundels. Interestingly enough, one of these aircraft even ended up in Sweden. A local civilian company bought it to tow aerial targets. This kept it flying right up until 1950. But aviation technology was moving fast. By the early 1950s, the aging AR-96 and all of its foreign-built derivatives were being retired in droves across Europe. The jet age had arrived, and the old piston engine trainers just could not keep up. Still, a few airframes soldiered on for a few more years as civilian glider tugs. And this entire operational history traces right back to the very first line of variants. That is the baseline AR-96A series. The AR-96A series included the early prototypes and the first production variants of the AR-96. It was a two-seat trainer. It was built specifically for advanced pilot training in the German Luftwaffe. These trainers were exclusively powered by air-cooled, 8-cylinder Argus AS-10C engines. These engines put out 240 horsepower. The initial test prototypes were low-wing monoplanes. They featured retractable landing gear and a long, fully glazed canopy. Inside, the instructor and student pilot sat in a tandem layout. This gave them excellent visibility during training flights. The aircraft made its maiden flight in 1938. This was followed by rigorous testing at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test center. Curiously, during those initial tests, some prototypes were deliberately fitted with fixed landing gear. This allowed engineers to evaluate the baseline handling characteristics of the airframe. By 1939, a small pre-production batch of these aircraft rolled off the assembly line. They were fitted with standard retractable landing gear. They were used primarily for operational evaluation. Soon after, a few limited production runs followed. These were completely unarmed trainers. They were equipped with only basic flight instruments. They retained the highly successful overall design of the first prototypes. This included that elongated canopy. It gave the pilots exceptional forward and over-the-side visibility. However, the A series had one major flaw. The AS-10C engine was simply underpowered. Because of this lack of power, the aircraft could not fully perform its intended role as an advanced trainer. As a result, the variant was quickly superseded by a new series. This was the AR-96B. It received a significantly more capable power plant. The introduction of the AR-96B series was a massive step forward. The new aircraft did not just get a stronger engine, it also featured a stretched fuselage to accommodate larger fuel tanks. This made it ideal for advanced pilot training. Thanks to the 12-cylinder Argus AS410A1 engine pushing 465 horsepower, flight performance improved drastically. The aircraft could now hit a top speed of 205 miles per hour. It could also reach a service ceiling of over 23,000 feet. Structurally, it remained a low-wing monoplane. It featured a comfortable tandem cockpit under a continuous glass canopy. A key strength of this model was its rugged reliability. This was vital for the rigors of intensive flight training. In 1940, the first 20 aircraft of the updated series rolled out. They acted as a stepping stone toward full-scale production. These airframes received the first major aerodynamic and structural upgrades. This paved the way for the standardized variants to come. Starting in 1941, this standard trainer became the mainstay of Luftwaffe flight schools. It carried no weapons, however, it was fully equipped with radio gear. This made it possible to teach student pilots instrument and night flying. Its primary job was teaching the fundamentals of aerobatics and navigation. Meanwhile, the dual flight controls allowed the instructor to take full command of the aircraft whenever needed. Later on, an ARM variant appeared. It was designed specifically for gunnery and tactical training. Right above the engine cowling, it mounted a single forward-firing 7.92mm MG-17 machine gun. Additionally, underwing bomb racks were added to carry small practice bombs. This setup allowed pilots to simulate aerial combat and light ground attack profiles. This made the aircraft an essential platform for training future fighter pilots and ground attack crews. Later versions were built specifically for aerial gunnery training. However, they produced far fewer of those. Ultimately, the sheer scale of the AR-96B series is staggering. They manufactured over 2,500 of these aircraft. They became the true cornerstone of Germany's training fleet. They served all the way up to the very end of the war in 1945. Licensed production of the famous AR-96 actually began right in the middle of World War II. Starting in 1941, the Avia and Letov factories, located in occupied Czechoslovakia, built them. Notably, the assembly of these aircraft did not stop even after the war ended. From 1945 to 1950, production kept going under the new designation C-2B. Altogether, around 330 of these airplanes rolled off the assembly line during that period. To meet local operational needs, they received updated radios and upgraded instruments. Later on, these aircraft did not just serve reliably in the Czechoslovak Air Force. A number of them were also exported. While the war was still going on, German engineers at Arado developed a new model, the AR-396. The main idea behind this project was to strictly conserve scarce strategic metals. Because of that, they built the airplane mostly out of wood, giving the fuselage and wings a stressed plywood skin. At the same time, the overall look and layout of the aircraft remained identical to its predecessor, the AR-96. Under the cowling, they packed a powerful inverted V12 Argus AS411MA engine. It produced 580 horsepower. They planned to use this airframe as an advanced trainer for pilot instruction. However, by 1945, they only managed to build a few prototypes. Mass production never materialized in Germany. However, the successful design later inspired other countries to build their own licensed copies. In post-war France, a local company called Société Industrielle pour l'Aéronautique, or SIPA for short, bought the production rights to the AR-396. Their very first product was the S-10. Between 1947 and 1950, the French built 28 of these aircraft. They fitted them with Renault 12R engines. This was essentially a French modification of the same 580 horsepower German Argus engine. These airplanes were heavily used for training and liaison duties right up until the 1960s. A short time later, an armed two-seat version called the S-11 was introduced. The French Air Force acquired another 50 of these aircraft, powered by that same reliable Renault engine. No further major modifications were developed from this airframe. That being said, in the early post-war years in Europe, a few surviving AR-96 airframes were converted into civilian two-seaters. They were mostly used for crop dusting and various utility jobs. The production history of this airplane was quite complex. Initially, the AR-96 was built at the main Arado Flugzeugwerke facility in the German port city of Warnemünde. That is where they assembled the very first prototypes and early production AR-96A aircraft from 1938 to 1940. Eventually, the demand for the trainer grew so much that the Arado facilities just could not keep up with the production orders. Because of this, from 1939 to 1941, production of the next series, the AR-96B, had to be partially subcontracted out. It went to a subcontractor, AGO Flugzeugwerke. This was a former subsidiary of the aviation giant Junkers, located in the German town of Oschersleben. As the war escalated, the Luftwaffe command decided to disperse their aircraft production to keep it safe from bombing raids. So, in mid-1941, they moved the main assembly lines to occupied Czechoslovakia. Local companies took over the work there. This included the Avia plant located near Prague, and Letov, which joined the process in late 1943. Together, they built about 80% of all the AR-96 aircraft ever produced. After the war ended, the Czechoslovak government took control of the Avia plant, but licensed production did not stop. They kept rolling out the C-2B model right up until 1948. Meanwhile, in France, the SIPA company was busy building wooden versions of the aircraft for the French Air Force. Altogether, the French built 188 of these aircraft, broken down into 4 different variants. These included 28 S-10s, 50 S-11s, 52 S-12s, and 58 S-121s. Overall, between 1939 and 1945, German aircraft manufacturers and their contractors rolled out almost 3,000 Arado Ar-96 trainers, 2,891 to be exact. That impressive number covers both the initial Ar-96A baseline series. It also covers the most widely produced and best-known variant, the Ar-96B. Production was not limited to a single facility. It was strategically dispersed across several plants. For example, Arado itself assembled around 150 aircraft. Meanwhile, the AGO plant produced over 200 more, but the bulk of the production took place in occupied Czechoslovakia. There, the local Avia and Letov factories combined to build more than 2,300 aircraft. This was just to meet the massive Luftwaffe demand for trainers. Production of these aircraft began in 1939. The first batch of 50 Ar-96A trainers rolled off the line. They immediately proved to be excellent training platforms. By 1940, the more powerful and refined Ar-96B was introduced. Production rates really started to climb. Output peaked in 1942 following a major expansion at the Czechoslovak plants. Even in 1945, despite the chaos and destruction of the final months of the war, production continued. Factories kept delivering new airframes right up until Germany surrendered. Production of this aircraft didn't stop when World War II came to a close. Post-war licensing agreements led to the production of several hundred more. In Czechoslovakia, Avia produced over 200 C-2B variants. These were built specifically for the Czechoslovak Air Force between 1945 and 1950. Meanwhile, the Letov plant added almost 200 more trainers to the fleet. The last airframes rolled off the line in 1948. By the late stages of the war, the German aviation industry was facing a critical shortage of resources. Severe material shortages caused overall production rates for trainers to drop by about a third. This drop occurred across 1944 and 1945. However, the massive Allied strategic bombing campaign barely made a direct dent in Ar-96 production. This was because in 1942, the Germans had the foresight to disperse assembly lines. They moved them to well-hidden locations across occupied territories. They even utilized massive underground facilities and satellite factories in Czechoslovakia to build the aircraft. Unsurprisingly, the primary operator of the Ar-96 during World War II was the Luftwaffe. For them, this aircraft became the standard for getting new pilots flight ready. Out of the roughly 2,800 airframes built during the war, nearly all went straight to flight schools. There, they were used for advanced training and night flying. They were also used for teaching pilots how to fly purely on instruments. By 1942, the Ar-96 had become a cornerstone of the Luftwaffe pilot training pipeline. It was flown almost everywhere. It went from primary flight schools and officer academies to specialized fighter wings. There, rookie pilots completed their final stage of training before strapping into frontline combat aircraft. Some combat units, like the 3rd Squadron of the legendary 5th Fighter Wing, used the aircraft for currency flights. This allowed veteran pilots to keep their skills sharp even during heavy fighting. Outside of Germany, other Axis powers operated these aircraft as well. For instance, starting in the summer of 1941, the Croatian Air Force and the Croatian Air Legion used them. They were utilized for advanced aircrew training. Right at the start of World War II in 1939, the Bulgarian Air Force purchased 24 Ar-96B2 trainers. As for Romania and Hungary, they operated the type in very limited numbers. They had mostly just a few captured examples or small batches. These were supplied by their allies strictly for training. The Italian Air Force, on the other hand, showed little interest in the model. They never officially adopted it. Beyond the Axis powers, these trainers were also exported to neutral countries. This was a testament to the reliability, simplicity, and versatility of this highly successful aircraft. During World War II, neutral Sweden managed to salvage and rebuild a few crashed German Arado Ar-96s. They used them for detailed evaluation and pilot training. At least one of these aircraft was rebuilt after a 1944 crash. It officially joined the Swedish Air Force and remained in service well into the mid-1950s. Later on, parts from that specific airframe were donated to the German Museum of Technology in Berlin. They were used to help restore one of the few surviving examples. Further evidence of Swedish use came to light when two additional AR-96 airframes were later discovered. One was actually recovered from the bottom of a lake. This provided invaluable parts for full-scale reconstructions. Another neutral country, Switzerland, also closely evaluated the AR-96 in the early 1940s. Their military considered it an ideal platform for advanced pilot training. However, strict wartime restrictions prevented them from securing a production license from the German Aviation Ministry. Undeterred, the Swiss used that rejection as motivation to develop their own aircraft, the Pilatus P-2. Entering service in 1946, it fully met their need for a modern trainer. There are no confirmed records of an AR-96 ever being delivered to Switzerland. Even so, the German aircraft heavily influenced Swiss design philosophy. This was especially true for their low-wing monoplanes designed for instrument and night flight training. Post-war, civilian use of these aircraft inside Germany was kept to an absolute minimum. A handful of demilitarized AR-96s were transferred to local glider clubs. Naturally, this all happened under the strict supervision of the Allies. However, these flights were very much the exception rather than the rule. Strict bans on aviation activity and severe material shortages ensured they stayed grounded most of the time. Despite this, the aircraft's story was far from over. After World War II, the Czechoslovak Air Force continued to operate the type extensively thanks to local licensed production. Designated as the Avia C-2B, it served primarily as an advanced trainer in their flight schools. Between 1945 and 1950, local factories rolled out over 400 of these airframes. Roughly 200 of them remained in active service until late 1958. They were used for a variety of roles. This included everything from glider towing and aerial gunnery training to light transport duties. Additionally, dozens of these aircraft were exported to Eastern Bloc nations like Bulgaria and Hungary. There, they performed similar roles. Over in France, the Air Force, the Armée de l'Air, adopted wooden versions of the related AR-396 model. Local industry built them under the S-10 designation alongside a modified S-11 version powered by Renault engines, which entered service after 1946. These aircraft were a perfect fit for advanced French pilot training. They kept flying until 1962. Meanwhile, the later S-12 and S-121 variants remained in service well into the early 1970s. They were evaluated by naval aviation and even saw combat. In the late 1950s, during the Algerian War, these airplanes flew reconnaissance and light strike missions against enemy targets. Poland also briefly operated a small number of captured AR-96 aircraft for military training in the early post-war years. However, they retired them relatively quickly. A similar situation played out in the Soviet Union. Soviet specialists used captured examples for testing and limited training. And even though the Soviets had total control over many former German aircraft factories, they never actually put this model into mass production or widespread service. By the late 1950s, these aircraft were reaching the end of the road in the Eastern Bloc. They were gradually replaced by more modern piston engine trainers like the Yak-11. Eventually, they gave way to the jet age with trainers like the Aero L-29 Delphin. This reflected a broader shift toward modernized equipment standardized along Soviet lines. Taking a look at the technical specs of the Arado Ar-96, it featured a solid all-metal design. A flushlight alloy skin covered the entire fuselage and wings. The tandem cockpit held a crew of 2. This included an instructor and a student pilot. As for its dimensions, the aircraft was 29 feet and 10 inches long. It had a wingspan of 36 feet and 1 inch. The height was 8 feet and 6 inches. The wing area came out to 184 square feet. Empty, the airplane weighed 2,855 pounds. Meanwhile, its maximum takeoff weight could reach 3,748 pounds. The heart of this trainer was a single Argus AS410 piston engine. This was an inverted V12 power plant. It delivered 465 horsepower on takeoff. This gave the aircraft very solid flight performance for its day. The Arado Ar-96 B-2 trainer could hit a top speed of 205 miles per hour at sea level. That gave it plenty of performance for future pilots' advanced flight training. All the while, the aircraft remained highly fuel efficient. Driving this performance was the reliable Argus AS410A1 engine. It put out 465 horsepower. Thanks to these capabilities, cadets could confidently practice complex aerobatics. They could also learn to fly strictly on instruments. This was done without putting themselves at unnecessary risk. At cruising speed, the aircraft comfortably held around 183 miles per hour. With a standard fuel load, it had a solid range of up to 620 miles. This was perfect for longer training flights. It was especially useful for practicing cross-country navigation. This was a strict requirement in Luftwaffe training programs. Its maximum flight altitude or service ceiling reached 23,300 feet. This allowed young pilots to get used to high-altitude conditions. The rate of climb sat at 1,000 feet per minute, so the crew could reach their required training altitude relatively quickly. In the air, the aircraft handled smoothly and predictably. This is essential for an airplane in this class. The controls were highly responsive. Its stall characteristics were very forgiving. Because of this, the risk of inexperienced cadets snapping into an unrecoverable spin was minimized. When it came to armament, the Arado Ar 96B2 variant was the standard model used specifically for tactical training. It was equipped with a single forward-firing 7.92mm MG-17 machine gun. This was mounted in the nose. The ammo loadout consisted of 500 rounds. This was meant strictly for instructors and students during gunnery practice. Occasionally, a gun camera was installed instead of a live machine gun. This safely simulated aerial combat. There was also a completely unarmed version. This was the AR-96B1. It was built purely for basic flight training. If needed, a reconnaissance camera could be mounted in the rear cockpit. This helped train crews in aerial navigation and observation. All these features clearly highlighted the primary role of the aircraft as a dedicated trainer. The designers intentionally omitted heavy armor and offensive weaponry. They did this in favor of safety and simplicity. This made the aircraft as forgiving and effective for new pilots as possible.